Join me, Mark Stone.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, James Matthews, as we take over the Sky News daily podcast for the week of the US election.
The election starts today.
We'll take you with us as we head out across the state, hearing from voters about the issues that will decide who becomes the next president.
Life was better under Trump.
It's a woman's right to choose.
See, the swamp don't want him in there.
On November 5th, we'll have a new president, and her name will be Kamala Harris.
And share our stories from the final days on the campaign trail.
Mr. Trump, over here.
We're from Sky News from the UK.
I thought I was going to see a punch up.
These are people all on the same side.
Exactly.
Every day at 5 p.m. So join us wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction from Sky News with me, Beth Rigby.
Me, Ruth Davidson.
And me, Harriet Harman.
Hello, ladies. Well, we promise you a bumper budget episode this week, and that's what we're going to do. Please follow us on your podcast app if you want to make sure we appear every week. And also, if you like it, leave us a review. I love getting 5 stars, 1 star less so. But, you know, I'm all for freedom, so you do what you like. So on this Halloween episode, and everyone has been doing their best with that analogy this morning, Nightmare on Downing Street, etc., etc., we want to step back and explain why this budget has finally helped define this Labour government. And we want to talk about whether we could have expected this budget from the Labour Party, which was campaigning to get into government but a few months ago. Now, I'd interviewed Rachel Reeves after her statement yesterday. We're going to talk about that too. She wouldn't be drawn on further tax rises. And to our listener Joe, who sent us that meme of a very confused woman looking at the sums and algebra and a message that just said, Beth, I'm going to need you to explain this budget to me. Joe, that's a bit like how my son talks to me, but normally that's about getting his dinner or helping him with his homework. Anyway, let's go. First things first, it was a bit of a gamble, this budget, isn't it? Because 40 billion in new tax rises, employers' national insurance, inheritance tax, capital gains tax, all going up, loads of borrowing to invest in public services. You'll have heard it all, £74 billion of spending. This is a big, big Labour tax and spend budget. But it also comes with a sting in the tail, because experts have been warning that it won't increase economic growth over the next 5 years. And you might remember that in the election campaign, Keir Starmer promised to make the UK economy the fastest growing economy in the G7. Also in this budget, the other thing to note was the big tax rises. The Office of Budget Responsibility, which is the independent financial forecaster that runs the ruins over the government's tax and spend plans and the economic forecast, suggested that net investment from businesses might actually flatline or even fall because of the tax rises. That, again, is something that Rachel Reeves would not have wanted. So it was absolutely mega. I've never covered a budget like it, and I've done quite a few. Believe me, I'm quite old and long in the tooth when it comes to budgets. Is it the budget that Labour promised when they campaigned back in May and June? Who wants to kick off with that, Harriet or Ruth? Who wants to go first?
I do. I feel really proud this morning, not just that we have had the first woman Chancellor giving her budget to the House of Commons, but we've had a woman Chancellor who has really bossed it. And I'm immensely proud of Rachel. I feel very encouraged because we have got the political stability that the country needs. I think there was no wobbles in advance of this. There was no wobbles and slip-ups, in the immediate aftermath. It was absolutely professionally delivered with massive support in Parliament. And I feel very hopeful about the economic progress. We'll now be able to see political stability and financial stability in government finances. So, it's a hard road to go on, but I think she set out an incredible path and she has bossed it.
Bossed it. Ruth, what do you think? Was it the budget we were led to believe would be happening in the general election campaign?
Do you know, I've got a couple of predictions. The first was that Harriet was going to be unbelievably on message today because it was a female chancellor that delivered it, and that
to be fair,
the whole
Ruth,
Labour lines to take.
Sometimes I've been
out.
off message on this podcast. To be fair, this is.
But today, my prediction is that you won't be, that you'll be almost entirely on message. And one of the others was that there will be at least one pasty tax issue that falls apart. And for me, I think that's going to be farms. On the upside, I thought in terms of what Harriet said of did Rachel Reeves look the part, sound the part, did she command the Commons, all of that, I thought she did. I thought she absolutely did. I think where she runs into trouble is in the substance of it, because this is not the budget that she promised the people of the United Kingdom. And I think they're going to notice because it's so far away from what she promised. And I also think the rationale for having changed what they said before the election to what they changed after the election is starting to fall apart, and that people aren't buying it. And if you've got the head of the OBR saying that 22 billion you're talking about, that's not what we said. We said 9.5 billion.
Let me jump in there, Ruth, just to explain. You remember that Rachel Reeves talked about that £22 billion black hole. This was the justification for all the tax decisions that she says she now has to make. The head of the OBR, which is who Ruth's referring to, said that they found 9.5 billion of public spending commitments that were not reported to them when they were doing financial forecasting for the previous government. So it's rather different from the 22 billion.
And I think that could be a difficulty for her.
So, and I think the bigger point as well in all of this, and Harriet, I will bring you back in a moment, was the difference or the departure from what the manifesto talked about in the words of change, but no, I called it fiscal flesh on the bones, if you like. So the big tax and spend decisions, they just weren't in the manifesto. And I asked Rachel Reeves about this in our interview yesterday.
I accept that this is a big and a substantial budget.
But
it wasn't the budget
might feel
that
let
I
down,
was.
that
It wasn't
you
the
weren't
budget.
straight with them.
It wasn't the budget that I was expecting to deliver when I became Chancellor on the 5th of July.
Tens of billions of pounds in increased spending and tens of billions of pounds of tax rises, none of which is in this document. You have a democratic mandate for this.
The first line of the first step in our manifesto was to return stability to our economy. That is the most important thing that I had to do as Chancellor. And we do have a mandate for bringing that stability back to the economy.
I think there'll be a lot of people thinking that they voted for you and you have just done the biggest tax and spend budget that we have seen for decades, and that is not what they signed up for. The document I was referring to there was I was sort of waving the manifesto around, so that was the document I took into the interview. What do you make of the Chancellor's response, Ruth? Do you think that's good enough?
You know, she said that the first line of her manifesto was that we'd return stability and therefore everything else is allowed. There's always a clip. In this social media age, there's a clip that catches you out. And she was asked on the run-up to the election by Bloomberg, you keep saying you've got no plans to raise all of these other taxes. Are you using the words no plans because it gives you the space in government to say, we didn't have plans to do this, but we do have plans now because we've seen the state of the public finances and we see that this is necessary to fix the public services, which is exactly what's happened. But her answer at the time was, no, I'm under no illusions about the scale of the challenge that I will face. I don't need to become Chancellor to know what a mess the government have made of public finances or public services, and the fact that the tax burden is at its highest level in 70 years. We don't need higher taxes. What we need is growth. And she's not delivering that.
I remember when we did the leaders event in Grimsby with Keir Starmer, and I went through various different tax rises, and he used exactly the same language. We have no plans to raise taxes beyond the 8 billion of taxes which were costed in the manifesto and allocated to spending. And I said to him, I actually turned to the audience and said, when you say no, what a politician means when they say no plans means they might. And they didn't much like me saying this, but it was true, wasn't it, Harriet? I mean, this idea, and I'm going to put this to you and you can, I don't know, see what you say, but the point about the interview with Rachel was this idea that Rachel Reeves, as the Shadow Chancellor going into number 11, suddenly opens the books and discovers that, oh dear, I didn't realise I needed this much spending or this much tax. It's just not true. They must have had an inkling before going into government that they would need to raise spending on public services, that they might need to tax more and they might need to borrow more. And they just didn't. Whether you agree with the budget or not, isn't it fair to say, Harriet, that for some people out there, they'll think this Labour government did not level with us and there is a democratic deficit in that? Is that fair or totally unfair?
I don't think that's the case, and I think they had more than an inkling of what the problems were. And they told everybody the economy is in a mess. The promises that have been made that the government says it will deliver on, there's no money to come to pay for them. And people could see for themselves the problems that there were in the health service. So they had more than an inkling about the problems that there were. But what they didn't know was that it was even bigger, Harriet, of a problem than they thought in advance.
I'm going to come back on that because I did an interview with Wes Streeting about a year ago in which I got it was a long interview, I got lots of information from various public health experts like the King's Fund. Everyone was saying, yes, you need to reform the NHS, but it will need more money. And I spent 25 minutes going at this with Wes Streeting, who's now the health secretary, where he repeatedly said to me, Beth, this is not about money, it's about reform. Beth, this is not about money, it's about reform. And I said, it's also about money. Yesterday, the government announced £25 billion in additional spending for the NHS in the first 2 years of government.
With no reform. With absolutely no reform baked in.
Well, the reform package is coming in 6 months' time. I'm just saying, the idea that they didn't know about that before the election, I just find that really difficult to believe. So then my question again is, why did they not level with the public and say, if we need to fix the NHS, we are going to have to borrow more or lift taxes to do that? But they didn't. They said, we're going to get it all through growth. It's going to come through economic growth and reform. We're not raising taxes, no plans beyond what was in the manifesto. It just wasn't true.
But they did say that the NHS was on its knees and part of the problem was lack of funding. But they also said very clearly, and Wes Streeting has been absolutely out there on this, that there needs to be reform and there needs to be investment into the NHS to enable it to change in the way that puts it on a modern, proper footing so that it can do the things it needs to do. For example, investment in AI to actually make the NHS more productive, investment that can see people doing things differently. So I just think there's no case to make that they didn't say that the NHS was in problems and it needs investment, but also that it needs change. And Wes Streeting is going to bring out, as Health Secretary, those proposals in the spring.
So I accept that, Harriet. I completely accept that they did say that, particularly post-COVID, although they didn't say that, they said because of 14 years of Tories. But there was going to be, there were some big problems and we needed to overhaul the health service. They needed both investment and reform. Completely accept. I will cede all of that ground. But you cannot get away from the fact that they said that in the run-up to the election that they would raise taxes by about $9.5 billion. And they've raised it by 40 billion. And when they were asked, are you sure that's all you need? They went, yeah. There's no more taxes, no more extra, no more nothing. Like, we promise that's all we're going to need to do. And they've more than quadrupled that. And the reason that they've said they've quadrupled it is because there was a £22 billion black hole. And they said that the reason we know there's a £22 billion black hole is because we asked the OBR to check for us. And they did. And that's what they told us. And you got the head of the OBR coming out saying, we never said that. We never said anything like that. Nothing in that review was a legitimisation of that 22 billion was the actual words that he used. It was less than half of that. So somewhere on the line, if we're being kind, there's a disconnect between what they promised and what they've done. Or if you're going to be a bit more brutal about it, was they looked down the camera lens during the election and they lied to the electorate.
I just think
that's what they've done.
I think that's really unfair. I think that they looked around and they said, there's no confidence in the economy. People are not investing. We need to have investment so that we can have growth. They looked around. They said the public services are busting. We need to have investment in the NHS, but we also need to have change in those public services as well. But in terms of the actual scale of it, well, they said that there was a bigger problem than they appreciated. And to be fair, the Office of Budget Responsibility said that the Treasury under the Tories had withheld information which would have made made a material difference to their assessment of the economy and the forecast. There's an issue now between 22 billion. Was it a 22 billion pound black hole or was it a 9 billion pound black hole? This morning, Rachel Reeves is saying that their assessment about it being 9 billion didn't take into account various things. And she's put in the budget statement a line by line of where that 22 billion pound black hole came from. But what they're doing is they're delivering on the manifesto commitments, which is to stabilise the economy so that there is a basis for investment and growth, and thereby that will provide the sort of economy and the public services that we need.
And the problem that they have is that the manifesto commitments that you say are in there, everybody said to them, journalists said to them, when there was head-to-heads between Rishi and Keir, they were saying to them that your manifesto commitments cannot be paid for by what you say you're going to raise taxes by. And the budget that's just been announced, the people that run the rule over this say there will be no growth.
You might at first glance feel a bit anxious if you look and see that it dips down to 1.5 after a few years in terms of the growth rate. I think the first thing to say about that is under the Tories, quite often the prediction of growths were less than 1%. They were virtually within the margin of error. So at least the OBR is forecasting there will be growth. So I'm expecting and confident that those growth forecasts will prove to be an underestimate.
Part of the problem for growth in this country is the productivity problem that we have in the UK, and part of
exactly
the issue
which needs investment.
That people have.
Yeah, which needs investment.
It needs investment, but it also needs reform. And how many pay claims has Labour settled since they came into government in the last 3 months that have required zero reform for massive payouts, for 22% payouts? How many of them have required an output change, a change in working, a better productivity, something that will help in that sector produce growth in this country? None of them. They just handed over the cash.
We have a pay review body system, and also Rachel and the government has made it quite clear that the investment in the NHS is contingent on there being change and reform. So, I hear what you're saying and everything, and I know that, there's always a lot of noise around the budget, but I feel really strong and stable, to coin a phrase. I feel strong and stable.
God,
and honestly, but this is not me just splurging the message, because I have felt quite unleashed, to coin a phrase, and prepared to go off message on this podcast. I think Rachel has absolutely smashed it.
The other thing that I want to talk about briefly is the conspiracy of silence, which is what Ruth was referring to there, because in the run-up to the election, lots of economists and experts talked about the conspiracy of silence. Paul Johnson from the Institute of Fiscal Studies talked about a conspiracy of silence. And what he was referring to was looking at the spending plans of government. There was going to be, after the election, a reckoning where whoever won was going to either have to put up taxes or increased borrowing or massively cut spending, right? That it just didn't add up. And this was before the black hole was even discovered, whatever size it was. This was regardless of the black hole. And so as journalists, our job in the run-up to the election was to say to Labour, you keep telling us there is not a return to austerity, and you keep telling us that you are not going to have to raise taxes or increase borrowing beyond what you have said in the manifesto, and it doesn't add up. Harriet, it never added up, did it? And that is that is true.
It did add up, but what has actually made it did add up, but what's made Paul Johnson's prediction come true is the black hole. But I think at the end of this all...
But that's the thing, is that it doesn't. Like, even if it was 22 billion, which the OBR says it's not, it's less than half of that. Even that doesn't account for £40 billion of extra taxes, nearly £80 billion of extra spending, the highest tax burden in the history of the United Kingdom since tax burdens were calculated, and borrowing that's, that they also said they wouldn't change the fiscal rules to have greater borrowing, and they've done that too.
They were being told before the election, this is a very bad situation. This is going to be painful. We have got to have economic stability. We've got to put the public finances back on track because we want to clear the way for investment in the economy to lead to growth. And that is what Rachel Reeves did in her budget yesterday.
And actually, I have had messages from people saying that after this budget, they felt pretty hopeful, that they liked the idea of big investment in public services, that they wanted the government to kind of get a grip of this. And so even though I would argue it's a departure from the manifesto in terms of what they actually explain to the public, many people might quite like this because they're borrowing to invest and then they're taxing business and wealthy people. But it is, if you like, a classic Labour budget. It's big tax, it's big spend, it's big state intervention. And I actually put this to the Chancellor because when I ran through some of the tax rises that she had announced, it wasn't a million miles away from what Jeremy Corbyn had said to the British people he would raise in taxes, at least in 2017. Let's have a listen to that exchange. In 2017, the country rejected a manifesto from Jeremy Corbyn that talked of taxes of 48.6 billion. In 2019, they emphatically rejected planned taxes rises from a Labour manifesto of 82 billion. You now today roll in with a 40 billion tax rise after the general election.
We inherited a situation where there was a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. There were commitments to compensate people for infected blood and the Post Office Horizon scandal, and the path for public spending was not honest.
So a lot of people
we've had to
will
make
look at
difficult decisions based on the inheritance that we face. I don't get to choose the inheritance.
Jeremy Corbyn's full fat on tax and spend. It seems to me like, are you at half fat or are you just being dishonest?
Well, no one's ever compared me to Jeremy Corbyn before. I stood down from his shadow cabinet because I disagreed with everything that he was doing.
You're asking the public for 40 billion tax rises. Can you at least reassure people there are no more tax rises after this?
Well, I've committed to just have one budget a year. I'm not coming back to this in
this
spring.
Parliament.
No, I'm not going to make commitments to never change taxes again. That would be irresponsible.
Harriet, obviously Rachel Reeves did not much like being likened to Jeremy Corbyn, but do you understand why I made the point, which was, at least with Jeremy Corbyn, the public understood it was going to be a massive tax and spend type government. They might not have understood that about Rachel Reeves before the election.
I think she was perfectly comfortable with you asking her that question, and she was able to say this is entirely different from the approach that Jeremy Corbyn would have taken, that what she wants to do is to raise enough money to plug the hole in the public finances. This is not tax for its own sake. This is tax to mend the hole in the public finances so that we can actually have investment in the economy, so that the economy can grow, so that the increasing growth can fund public services.
Are you worried, Harriet, that it might unravel this budget, that there might be a backlash?
I don't think so. I think that politically she's got things nailed down. She won't have difficulty getting her finance bill through. And business wants certainty. They want to know that things are not going to be U-turning and they're going to be not going to be an omni-shambles. And I think that then the proof of the pudding will be all the new announcements that comes for new opportunities for planning and investment. I'll just give you one example. In what my former constituency of Campbell and Peckham, there's an estate called the Bells Gardens estate, which was pulled down because it needed to be pulled down. There's planning permission for there to be new homes there, and there are weeds growing out of what is an empty building site. After this budget yesterday, Southwark Council are going to be able to start building new council homes there. That's what people are going to start seeing from this budget. No more weeds drifting across an empty building site. There'll be people with hard hats building homes.
But Harriet, and I know everyone's going to get their tiny violin out for big business, but in the manifesto, it said, and I know it was on working people, but it said we will not raise NI. Many businesses would have taken that as a protection on national insurance employee contributions.
No, they wouldn't.
And now they find themselves, well, I've spoken to business people that have told me this directly, they now find themselves suddenly having to find loads more money to pay in tax, and that was not pitch-rolled before the election. And the reason it matters is whether you agree or disagree with me, this Labour government need business on side. They have said they are pro-business, and then in their first budget, they hit them with a £25 billion tax rise, that is going to be controversial.
Well, obviously, it's not going to be popular with business, but it can't be said that it's a breach of the manifesto commitment, because national insurance contributions paid by employers is a business tax. It's not a tax on working people. And what we put in our manifesto...
Can I just say Harriet's got the manifesto here? Shall I read it to me?
No, if you read out the line, it says, we will not increase national insurance. We did this. We did a whole podcast on this.
I've been back...
We did a whole podcast on this.
It does say working people.
It says working people before that, but it does also,
Ruth,
say,
I've thought about,
we will not raise.
I've thought about this extensively. I've searched that bloody manifesto to find that quote repeatedly.
It's just got one place.
Read it to me again, Harriet.
It's only got one place where it mentions income tax and national insurance. It says this: we will ensure taxes on working people are kept as low as possible. Full stop. Labour will not increase taxes on working people, comma, which is why we will not increase national insurance, the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax or VAT. So what she's saying there, what the manifesto is saying there, is they're talking about taxes on people, not on businesses. But business can have confidence that they've got a sensible, grown-up chancellor who believes in the ambition of Britain that they share, that their business can grow in. So it's all fine.
OK, it's all fine, Ruth. Do you think it might unravel?
Yeah, so I don't think it's an omni-shambles. Omni-shambles budget was the 2012 George Osborne budget, where they did loads of cleaning up of little loopholes. So things like hot food had a different VAT rate.
Pasty tax.
Food, so they thought, they basically did lots of tiny little things that completely got undone because there was a reason that these loopholes and changes existed. So things like, they called it a pasty tax or a Greg's tax, caravan tax, bingo tax, all this sort of stuff, and it unravelled and they had to make lots of changes. I don't think this is an omni-shambles, but I think it's maybe a demi-shambles, in that I think there's at least one that's probably going to have to be reversed. And that was the change on inheritance tax for farms. So it's quite technical. Steve Reid is the DEFRA minister. He'd been in a big fight with the Treasury about this. He's clearly lost because he wanted agricultural property relief. So that means that you're not charged at 20% when you pass your farm onto your kids for anything that's above more than £1 million. And £1 million sounds like a lot, but if you've got a couple of farm buildings, sheds, machinery sheds, some land, like almost all family farms, even small family farms, are above that threshold. So it's a massive whacking great cash tax bill you have to give the government if you pass on your farm to your kids, and they have to find. And the thing about farmers is they might be land rich, but they're pretty much cash poor because farming is not massively profitable. And if you go onto X or Facebook or any of the other streaming sites, you just got all of these heartbreaking videos of farmers sitting in the cabs of their tractors doing 30 seconds just looking broken, going, I was only keeping doing this to pass it on to my kids. That was why I was doing it. I'm going to have to get out. I'm going to have to sell to big agribusiness. And the thing is that losing a farm is not like losing another business. It can't come back. And the reason I know that is because that line is the exact line that Keir Starmer gave to the NFU conference last year. He went to farmers and he said, the lack of long-term planning is not on, you deserve better than that. And he looked them in the eye. And this is another thing where I think that the government's in a little bit of trouble, because it doesn't matter to the public if people like Beth give Rachel Reeve a hard time in an interview, or people like me, who's a Tory, shout at the government, or Rishi Sunak does, or the IFS or some other think tank they've never heard of and don't really know if they're independent or not independent. But when you've got people like farmers saying, you stood up in front of us and you promised us one thing and you lied, and we're going to have to sell the farm and we can't pass it on to our kids, that's a problem. When it's ordinary people in sectors that you can know and touch and feel are telling you that you stood in front of us and you lied, that has traction. And that's where I think that it would be in Rachel Reeves's interest to take the hit and reverse the farm tax as quickly as she can, because, we don't want food insecurity in this country. We don't want agribusiness running everything. We don't want higher prices. These are tangible things that even if you've never set foot on a farm in your life, you can feel if you're just a normal punter that goes shopping in the supermarket. And I think that was a mistake.
Labour did win a lot of rural seats in this election, Harriet. What do you think? Do you think that maybe she might need to think again on that? For the amount it raises, for the amount of maybe real-term fallout it has in communities around the country?
Well, I think it's a good thing that Labour has within the Parliamentary Labour Party, that the government has within the party of government, lots of constituencies which are properly agricultural, unlike Peckham, which had no farms in it, I have to confess.
Has it not got a city farm? Not even a city farm?
Not even a city farm
hell.
In Peckham. I think if you're talking about a family farm, like a family business, then often the children, the next generation, will be working and part of that farm and possibly owning it before the person's died. And in that case, there won't be any inheritance tax because they will be part of the business that is the farm before the older generation dies. I don't think there will be a U-turn on this. I think this is well thought through, and we'll see it all when it comes to the draft clauses in the finance bill, and I think they'll go through.
Well, look, we're going to go for a break. I need a lie down, and I think Harriet and Ruth need a hug. Right, we are back. Now, it's been totally nuts in Westminster this week for the budget, so we thought you might like to get the inside track on how everything works around the budget. Now, I want to start off with Harriet, because you actually watched the Chancellor deliver the budget from the Commons. I don't know how you snuck in, or were you in the gallery?
There is a Lord's gallery, so I was like, thigh to thigh with Peter Lilly and Geoffrey Archer and all sorts of people.
Stuff of dreams, that, ladies. Stuff of dreams.
Able to.
Oh, I just pulled a face when you said that. It was like I didn't even do it on purpose. It just happened.
Able to look down on Rachel delivering her budget.
Tell me all about it. Tell me all about it. I want to know.
I think you can easily take for granted the authority and control with which she presented that budget, and also the hegemony that she has over the whole of the government benches, which were jam-packed with people who were all getting loads of emails about the winter fuel allowance, and yet they were waving their order papers and cheering her to the rafters. She has got as much hegemony as Gordon Brown had after 1997.
Just to put it into context, she's the first female chancellor ever. We've had 800 years of chancellors, and she came out looking impeccable in her suit, and she held up that box. And I have to look through all the pictures really carefully because we make the television package for the evening, so we look at all the shots of the day. And you could see that she felt the moment. She felt the moment of coming out and being that woman.
Not a tremor. It's her analysis, it's her prescription, it's her political judgment, it's her economic judgment. And that is quite something.
The pitch rolling that was done on this, the stuff that ended up in the papers and on the television and in the news that we knew about before, how do you get hold of that?
Yeah, how much is leaked and how much is briefed?
With this budget, it was so consequential that I think within the Treasury there was a decision to leak some of this information, because Rachel Reeves did not want to stand up and do such a massive budget without pitch rolling some of it, so that when she stood up and said £25 billion in employers' national insurance contributions in tax, she did not want that to be the headline the next day. Just massive surprise tax, right? That's not useful to her.
You don't usually have an election in July, which means that you've got a long delay before you get the budget because you've got the summer recess. Usually you have an election in May and then you have the budget before the summer recess, and therefore you don't have months and months of speculation which is stretched over the holidays and the conference periods, and that therefore has been a challenge.
It's interesting though, Harriet, because she was bollocked in the Commons, wasn't she, by the Deputy Speaker, because before the Speaker, because before she stood up they said budgets should be announced in the Commons and you've announced it everywhere bloody else, right? And it is a point, but on the other hand I do understand why they did it, because you cannot increase borrowing like that without massively flagging it beforehand in case the markets take fright. But it goes back to the fundamental principle of that's because it wasn't in the manifesto. It's because they didn't put it in the manifesto. So then when they decide after the election this is what they're going to do, or they decide before the election this is what they're don't tell us, that's a moot point about which one it was. They had to pitch roll it because it was massive. And if they didn't, it would have affected the markets. There would have been potentially a massive backlash. It would have been hang on a minute, where did all of this come from? So I don't think they had an option this time. But in terms of prepping a budget, how does it work for ministers trying to get their way and the money they want? What was it like? I mean, you must have been in the room and gone through this.
So you get appointed to your department, you go into your department and they have a whole load of papers for you, a whole load of files on your desk showing what the problems are financially in the department, all the promises that have been made and all the inability to fund them. And then they do masses of papers for you to present to the Chancellor, for you to present to the Treasury to say, this is the money we need. And so the Treasury sit there and they get all of this from all the different departments. And of course, it doesn't add up. So then different, as Secretary of State, you think, blimey, my department is really being hit. How come they're getting the money? How come all the money's going to health when we need it here in the welfare bill? So that there's quite a lot of competitiveness between the different Secretaries of State because they think they're getting the wrong end of the stick and they're getting short shrift from the Treasury. So there's a lot of competition and the Treasury and the Chancellor have to sit there in the middle and say, we're going to do this. Sorry, we're not going to do that. But the point is you don't really know until the budget is actually announced in the House of Commons. You've got an idea of what might happen, but they're all sitting there looking knowledgeable and knowing, and they don't know the absolute detail as to how sick they're going to be as they walk back into their office or whether they're going to strut back in as conquering heroes.
So look, people might think of the cabinet as kind of a group of people working together. But is it an absolute bun fight where everyone wakes up hating Wes Streeting because he got the lion's share of the spending and they lost out? And and as Ruth was saying, if you're the Environment Secretary, you're now just getting a backlash from all the farmers. Is that what it's like? Does it create sort of personal rivalries?
It absolutely does, because when you go into your department, you need to fight for your department to get what your department needs so that you can deliver. And if you lose out in that fight, then there's huge problems, and that makes you very envious of others who seem to be leading a charmed life when you've got to do a very difficult job. So it is quite difficult to have that sort of solidarity. So you'll see the kind of rather fixed smiles on everybody's face when Wes Streeting gets another huge numbers of billions and they think, blimey, and I've got even more cuts to endure.
And Ruth, when you were the leader of the Tories in Scotland, are you able to get in with the then Chancellor George Osborne and get money for Scotland? I know that there's a Scottish Secretary of State that sits in Cabinet, but did you have a little Ruth Davidson bat phone?
Yeah. So you always go down, you have the meeting and well, sometimes if you plan it right, you do the meeting while you're down. While I'm down, I'll just see the Prime Minister as well as the Chancellor, so you can get the political stuff as well as the economic stuff. So so there's some issues that you always want to talk about, and things like, for example, oil and gas, things like Scotch whisky, things like some infrastructure stuff that crosses the border. You want to get in. So much of the budget is England only or England and Wales only because so much is devolved in Scotland. That things like transport, health, education, all of these, lots of these big spending departments, actually what the Chancellor says doesn't relate to that. But things like business taxes, general taxation, anything to do with defence, that all affects Scotland. So you want to make sure that you're not diddled, but you are only one voice of many. But my experience, and it's been more than one Chancellor, I mean, I was leader of the Scottish Conservatives for nearly 8 years, so it's quite a few budgets, is that it's almost inscrutable. I mean, you're chatting to them and they nod along and it's all very warm and it's always warm and they're always very sympathetic and you still never know until they stand up if you're getting it or not.
So I have done a lot of budgets and I love a budget, but I have to say this budget blew my I have never there was a lot of me blinking in the studio as this budget landed. And we have something called in the Red Book. The Red Book is the budget book where all of the tax and spend decisions are outlined. And you go straight to what is called the scorecard. And the scorecard basically, so the Chancellor talks, and she talked a lot. This was a bloody long budget. I think it went on for an hour and 20 minutes. I mean, it was a lot. And I was like, get me the Red Book, because you need the Red Book because it kind of reveals, for all of the language, it tells you the hard decisions she's taken. And I get this scorecard and I start looking through it and I was like, can't process the scorecard too big.
Can I say a thing here about Rishi Sunak? Because the hardest job in politics is the budget response. Because what you hear are the words that the Chancellor says, and they will put the spin on it that they want. What you don't have is actually you don't have the Red Book that you can go through at the time. So you've got to respond to it, not knowing what's coming, only listening to her words and not seeing the figures. And it's really, really hard to do. I think he did a pretty good job. He was very angry, partly because he foresaw quite a lot of the taxing, borrowing and spending, and he couldn't land the line at the election. But yesterday was his last big outing at the dispatch box as a front bencher, both doing PMQs and doing the budget response. And, you know, I think that, I mean, he took an absolute thumping at the election, worst result. I think he's actually redeemed himself a lot in the months since, in terms of how he's handled himself. And I think I just want to say a word for how hard he had to work to try and stabilise things, and also for doing, you know, quite a lot of heavy lifting in the last 3 months and doing it with quite good grace.
I mean, Harriet, you were just picking up on what Ruth said about Rishi Sunak. You know that song, This Girl Is on Fire? The Girl Is on Fire, that one. I was like, wow, Rishi Sunak's on fire. What was it like in the Commons? Like, there was a vibe.
Well, it's unusual because usually, as Ruth, I mean, obviously, it's the leader of the opposition who does it, not the shadow chancellor. And it's unusual for a leader of the opposition to have been the chancellor. So he felt he knew more about it than she did because he'd been Chancellor for longer than she had. Having twice done that response, I can tell you, you sit there and there's this enormous Red Book. And whilst the Chancellor is actually reading out the budget statement, you've got researchers in a room about 100 metres away piling through the scorecard, looking, sending you in notes which are absolutely incomprehensible in order to feed into your speech, because you then have to stand up and do a critique and not look like a total prat, which I can tell you is not easy. So
if that's his last front bench speech, and it probably will be, I think he probably went home last night and poured himself a soda and lime, because he's not a drinker, and probably thought he'd put in a shift yesterday.
Honestly, it was the best I had seen him for a long time. So, you know, I think he went out there on a high. I think we are going to be talking about the budget, the ramifications. I think now we're going to be getting a lot more from Labour about the missions, and they talked about giving progress reports on these 5 missions and sketching out what they really mean. This budget will be the foundation for all of that, and we are going to be talking about it a lot. And you should listen to this podcast because it's going to affect all of your lives, what this Labour government does in the next few years. But that is all we have time for when it comes to the budget. But I can't let Ruth leave without talking about one final thing, and that is the Conservative leadership election. And I should tell you that on Saturday, I am going to be back with bells and whistles on the telly box, because the result is announced on a Saturday. And also we are going to do a special podcast afterwards to discuss it. But before we get to all of that, there's a very important question that Harriet and I need to ask Ruth Davidson, and that is who she voted for. But Ruth, I'm going to give you a little moment before. You're sort of smiling, but I'm not. Is it a smile or a grimace? I think it's more of a grimace.
I have been so conflicted on this, so conflicted.
Before I drum roll you and I get the answer, to tee this up, here's a message from 2 of our listeners, Ruth.
Hi ladies, this is Lou. I'm a lifetime local government officer.
And I'm Bella, I'm an A-level politics student. We were both listening to the podcast on the Eurostar on the way to Paris.
And reason for leaving a message was just to share with you, I had a view on Ruth's quandary around the leadership ballot paper. As a long-time deputy returning officer and somebody whose job it is to adjudicate over doubtful ballot papers, I feel the only logical choice is for her to vote with a willy, like a not insignificant number of the electorate do in all elections. We have an officer sweepstake on the number we'll find each time. Thanks, bye.
It's true. It's honestly, if you've been to any
Not in Peckham, they don't. I've never seen genitals on a ballot paper in Peckham.
Well, they have done in both Glasgow and Edinburgh, where I've stood.
Ruth is digressing from the big question you asked, Beth.
Yeah, so I really struggled in this. Like, I was just about to leave to go to Ireland. I was like, oh my God, I need to return this. I've never not voted for something I've been entitled to vote for in my life. I had to go off and find the letter, which I hadn't even opened. And it turns out we've come into the 21st century. There's a QR code. I didn't even have to go and post it, which was great. So I did it online and I really struggled. And I voted for Robert Jenrick, who I don't think will win. So I don't think it's going to be my fault, whatever happens when the next leader of the party gets there. I struggle to believe that the person that's the next leader of the Tory party is going to take us into the next election in 5 years' time. And I struggle to believe that they're going to leave the leadership at a time of their own choosing. I think that there's going to be a level of scrutiny on either of the two that are in the final two that will be hard for them to bear, and that they may well be undone. The words of Harriet Harman rang in my ears as it was. You've got one who will say anything on television, most people will forget what it is, and one person who will never be forgotten for what they say, but that might not be a good thing. So if she said that was the choice, so it turns out somebody that would go on television and whose name would be written water and you would forget what they said almost as soon as they left is who I voted for on Harriet's sort of appraisal.
There you go, Harriet. How are you feeling about being the oracle for Ruth or the advisor for Ruth on her decision?
Well, I think Ruth's right that whoever gets this is going to find it very difficult because there's a political inheritance. We're talking about the budget with the economic inheritance of the last Tory government, but my goodness me, there's a political inheritance as well, a lot of which is to do with how are they going to deal with Farage and the far right. How are they going to deal with that? What's the direction going to be? And I think there's going to be so much fighting in the party. We'll see a few change of leaders before the next election.
I want to talk endlessly about this, but finally, Ruth, just quickly, so I understand your decision. You voted for Jenrick because you don't think he'll win anyway, and you don't think Kemi or Rob will be the leader at the next election.
She doesn't want to be
if I understood
Kemi
correctly.
I voted for Jenrick as, in my view, the least worst option. I'm justifying to myself that it might be also the clever choice on the grounds that if he doesn't win, then I'm not going to have to be continually tagged by you two as the person that put them in power.
It's a podcast calculation in everything she does
now. There's a podcast calculation, yeah.
Well, look, I am so excited about this Saturday result. I was speaking to a shadow cabinet minister last night and I said, because obviously Kemi is the favourite, and I said, what do you think? And he said, it's really unknown because we don't know what the turnout's going to be. We really don't, every time a poll's done, it doesn't touch a lot of maybe older Conservative voters that might not be as plugged in. So he said he genuinely doesn't know what the result will be. Anyway, thank you, Lou and Bella, for telling me about willies being drawn on ballot papers. I'm such an innocent. I just didn't know that was a thing.
It is a thing.
Does anyone ever do boobs on ballot papers? So it's always willies.
No, it's patriarchy run mad, Beth.
Oh my God. Remember, you can always send us your own voice note. Please do. And the more that it makes us laugh, the better. Send it on WhatsApp to the burner phone 07934 200 444 or email us at electoraldysfunction@sky.uk. Harriet, Ruth, thank you for that. That was an absolute stonker of a budget debrief. We will be back on Saturday. There's more of us on Saturday, so it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.